a brief video entitled The Problem of Sending Kids Back to School in COVID Times. The first question that we'll briefly consider is who suffered the most in COVID? And the answer is, the way I'm framing this question, is that there is a higher infection and death rate for people who are more socioeconomically disadvantaged than people who have high socioeconomic advantage. Why? Why are more people dying who are poor or from marginalized community or from communities that are discriminated against? Why are more people in those communities dying and more people getting infected? And the answer is they live with greater crowding. The nutrition factors may not be as good. Access to care may not be as good, including simply cars. Access to transportation to get to care. It's very multifactorial. Living with elderly people and multi-generational families. So the lack of funds to put people into specialized care homes, and we know how that worked out too. So and therefore living, instead of everyone having their own home, multi-generational families live together, which put the young together with the very old. So we know that the death rate and the infection rate are higher in disadvantaged communities. So as the more we cause the curve to be higher, the less we flatten the curve, the more we allow the infection rate to be higher, the people who we are causing to suffer are the poor and the disadvantaged. The second question I want you to consider is that when we start sending people back to work, who will get sick? And the answer is the people who are more in the front line, nurses, care aides for the elderly. Note that the people who do the direct hands-on care are often people who work harder and who make less. So if you notice, it's often the nurses in the ICU who are getting sick and the care aides of the elderly. The people who are actually working with their hands on people, the very front line. The more front line you are, often, and this is a sad fact, the more frontline, the more direct, compassionate care, as opposed to higher executive level care, the less a person gets, the less appreciation they get, the harder they work, the more noble they are, but the less appreciated, and the more likely they are to be women. The more overrepresented women are among professions that provide direct care, get less appreciation, are put at more risk, and make less. So if we go back to work, and they're all saying, if we go back, there will be some more cases. So imagine we deflatten the curve and go to this slightly higher flattened curve. These will be the new cases. Who will be harmed from those cases? The poor, the socioeconomically marginalized, women, and frontlines. That, make no mistake, who will be most hurt when we get pushed back. Who will most benefit? Rich people with stock portfolios. So the case that I want to make in the next few minutes is that by doing that, by enacting sending people back to school, instead of enacting education, we're going to be enacting something called counter-education or anti-pedagogy. So by sending kids back to school under these circumstances where this type of harm will be carried out, we're exactly accomplishing the opposite, the inverse function of education. We're doing something that I call counter-education or anti-pedagogy. Why? So let's accept the premise that teaching kids, in other words, the word for teaching kids is pedagogy, we do it to make the world a better place. We do it to give skills and knowledge to make a better world for our children. But the world is unfair, and it's based on power structures, and it harms the powerless. So how do we teach our next generation to overcome this, to overcome our prejudices, to overcome our injustice, to make a better world for all people? Because if we don't create hope, then why are we teaching? So we must be teaching to create hope. And in order to create hope, we have to create a fairer, better world. But how do we do that? How do we teach kids to overcome the social structure that we've put in that hold some people's heads over the water, under the water, that cause starvation, that cause poverty, that cause early loss of life? How do we teach the kids to to have the skills and knowledge and tools to make a better world than the one that we live in? Because that's what pedagogy is about. So there are two types of teaching. One, most teaching is teaching to obey. It's normative. We're promoting the normal values and normalized values of our current society. The teacher has authority over the classroom and has authority over the children, and therefore the teacher in the classroom with their authority is a microcosm of a broader world where there are positions of authority, and one has to obey authority and think within the realm of certain social structures and certain social conventions. And so, in other words, we're teaching children to obey, to accept, be normalized into certain social constructs, and to obey them. So teaching can be teaching to obey, where the teacher is in a position of authority. But a second way of teaching is what they call, and it was named by a writer, Paulo Freire, and the school of thought is called liberation pedagogy. And it's the only type of teaching that should be going on now, is we should teach children to think independently, where we believe that everyone has something to bring, and people have their own authority on their own lived experience. Because I don't know what it's like to be you, so I can't be an authority on that. So everyone in the classroom has some authority. And at least modern educational systems give lip service to that type of pedagogy, but it's important that we start, walking the walk as opposed to just talking the talk. And so the better type of pedagogy is liberating children, liberating them to think independently, of course within certain confines and certain rules. And how you do that is well defined by Paulo Freire and other thinkers like Bell Hooks, and I would encourage people to read it. I am not an educational theorist, but I do know, because I've taught in university, and I do know you teach much better when you deauthorize the classroom, you give people their own authority on their own lived experience, and you teach people to think independently. You don't try to cultivate obedience, you try to cultivate independent thought. The ultimate goal of this type of pedagogy is to liberate people and to liberate the children and give them freedom to create a better world than the one that they've inherited from us. By forcing children back to school during time of COVID, where we know that people who will suffer are the people who are oppressed in general by our social conventions, we are actually enacting an anti-pedagogy. We're using the schools as an agency to ignore the good type of social reform that we need to do to get through this pandemic, and rather to just enact and normalize the status quo, even if it results in the suffering and loss of life of the exact people that we need to start to elevate. And therefore, by using schools as an agency to continue normative social structure that continues to hold certain people's heads underwater, we are actually doing an anti-pedagogic function. We're using education to prevent the world from becoming a better place, and that is untenable. Do not send your kids back to school. For 2 months of education, for 1 month of education, at the end of the summer, they are not going to learn much, and people will get sick, and it's not right. Keep them at home. Tell them that you love them. Tell them that it's good that they're sacrificing, that they're being home with their families in order to protect the vulnerable in our society. That's the true pedagogy. And what should governments do? They should incentivize, and they should pay parents, especially poor parents, for the efforts of teaching. That's what should be done.